Hey gang, today I want to talk about line plots. Okay, if you're watching this, you need a little bit of work on a line plot. So let's start with what is a line plot? Well, it's a type of graph that allows us to see information without somebody having to tell us or without having to look at specific numbers. We can look at a line plot and we can easily kind of see some information and gather some information from that. Now, where's the information come from? Usually with a line plot, what happens is a lot of times people are surveyed. You might see the word survey in a question. How many people were surveyed? Survey is a fancy word for asked. Someone comes up to you and they say, I'm taking a survey. What's your favorite food to eat? You say pizza. And then they ask the next person, what's your favorite food to eat? Hot dogs. They ask the next person, hamburgers, and they're keeping track of how many times people say those words. They're taking a survey. So when you see that word survey, it simply means that someone was asked, okay? Now, not every line plot is about a survey. What really happens in a line plot is it's showing the frequency that something occurs. Frequency is how often it happens. Think about snow in North Carolina. Does that happen at a high frequency? Do we get a lot of snow here? We don't. We don't. As much fun as it is to go out and play in snow, we don't get a whole lot of it, so it has a very low frequency. It doesn't happen often. So when you see the word frequency, we're talking about how often it happens. So that's what a line plot does. It talks about how often something happens. And we simply mark how often it happens. A lot of times we use a tally chart to do that, okay? Or it's called a frequency table. A tally chart, we simply mark how often it happens. This is very much like a tally chart or a frequency table, except it's turned horizontally and the marks are going to go upward, okay? So, I've got a table here of the information. I went out in my garden, and as I was digging in my garden, getting ready to plant my seeds for the season, I kept finding worms. And I decided, because I've noticed that the worms were all different lengths, and I decided to keep track of the worms I found. So when I found a worm, I measured it and I wrote down its measurement. The first worm I found was a 1-inch long worm. The next worm I found was a 3-inch long worm. And I kept going. Every worm I found, I marked down the length of the worm. And so here's the results of what I had in my garden. Now, kind of hard to look at this and make any sense of it because they're all different sizes and they're all over the place. So by creating a line plot, it's going to help me to organize this information so I can look at it and I can very easily draw some conclusions about what I had. So I'm going to make a chart that shows worm lengths. Now, on a line plot, you're going to have a number line down here. That's where the line comes from. It's going to be a number line. It's going to go from a low number up to a high number. So how do we decide what to put on our line plot? How do we decide what numbers to put? Well, we want to go back and look at the data that we have. All right? What's the smallest number you can see in my data up here? What was the shortest worm that I found? Well, I have ones in here, don't I? So I'm going to start my numbers with the number 1. Okay? It's the lowest number that I've got. What's the highest number? What's the biggest one you see up there? I've got some 1s, some 3s. Do you see a bigger number? Yeah, there's a 5 in there, right? Is there anything bigger than a 5? No. So I'm going to count on my number line, because it's a line plot. I'm going to count on my number line from 1, my smallest one, to 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Simple enough? If I had an 8-inch long worm in there, would 1 to 5 work? No, I'd have to go all the way up to 8, wouldn't I? Does it make sense? Okay. Now, I want to tell, when I create my line plot, I want to tell what these numbers mean. These numbers mean inches. They're the lengths of the worms. So I'm going to write a label down here, and I'm going to write lengths of worms, and in parentheses I'm going to put IN period, meaning I measured them in inches. Okay? The numbers don't mean feet. Okay? That's a foot, that's an inch. So if it says it's a 3-inch long worm, it's 3 of these, right? Okay? So these are the lengths of worms in inches. Okay? Now, I'm going to put marks up here. Oftentimes you'll see a dot, you'll see an X. You're going to see some kind of marking to tell what you have. Now, I'm going to put a little key there, okay? And a key is nothing more than it tells what the mark means. So I'm going to use a little dot. And I'm going to say that a dot equals 1 worm. Every time you see a dot on my line plot, that's going to be 1 worm. So let's start with the 1-inch long worms. How many times do we see the number 1 up in my information here? Well, I've got 1, 2, 3. I have it 3 times. So I'm going to put 3 dots above the number 1 because I had 3 1-inch long worms. All right. How many times do I have a 2-inch long worm? Okay, I'm looking for 2's. 2's. 1, 2. It happened twice. All right, so I have 2. 3-inch long worms. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times. Okay? Now, just in looking at it so far, doesn't this make it a whole lot easier to see how many I got? Yeah, I can easily see that I probably had more 3-inch worms than anything else, right? Okay? How many 4-inch worms? 1, 2, 3. And then finally, how many 5-inch worms? 1, 2, 3 again. So here is my data shown in a line plot. Now it's organized. Now I can see all the 1s, I can see all the 2-inch worms and the 3-inch worms, the 4-inch worms, and the 5-inch worms. Now we've got to be able to answer questions about what we see, okay? As we answer questions, we have to remember that the lengths of the worms are these numbers down here. How many worms we had are above it. That's 3 worms. That's 2 worms. That's 7 worms, right? Because each dot means 1 worm. So now let's take a look at the questions and let's talk about the kinds of things that you've got to do with these questions to answer them, okay? Number 1 says, what is the length of the longest worm? What's the length of the longest worm? Well, where do I have the lengths of the worms? They're down here, aren't they? Okay? There's a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. What's the longest of those lengths? 5, isn't it? And did I have any 5-inch worms? I did. So the length of the longest worms that I pulled out of the ground were 5 inches. How many of those did I actually pull out? 3 of them, but the length of them is 5. 5 inches is the length of the longest worm that I found. Okay? Next, what is the length of the shortest worm? Okay, I pulled out all these worms. What length was the shortest one I found? Now, if 5 is at the long end, where do you think the short end is? Back here? Yeah. On a line plot, your lower numbers are going to be on the left side. Your larger numbers are going to be towards the right side because it counts in a numerical order. My shortest worm was a 1-inch worm. And I also found 3 of those, didn't I? Okay, but the question didn't ask how many of those. It said, what's the length of it? It was 1 inch, the shortest one. Number 3, what length worm was most common? Now this is going back to that frequency word. How often? Most common. Things that are common are things all the time. It's common to see people wearing pants. Right? It's common to see people wearing shirt or shoes. Those are common things. We see it all the time. High frequency, right? What length was the most common? Which one happened all the time? This one, right? It's much bigger than all the other ones, wasn't it? How long were those worms? 3 inches. So when it says what length were they? Well, they were 3-inch long worms. That was the one that was most common. Most common. Okay? Number 4, how many worms were 3 inches long or longer? All right, these kinds of questions, you have to really pay attention to where it's telling you to start and where it's telling you to go. All right? How many worms were 3 inches long? Let's start there. 3 inches long. So I'm going to go to the 3. This is where I'm going to start, right here. I have to count all of those 3-inch long worms. But I've also got to count any worms that were longer. Well, what's on my line plot? What's longer than 3? Which numbers are longer than 3? 4 and 5 are longer than 3 as well. So what this question is telling me, what it's asking me is, how many worms were 3 or longer? 3 or more. 3, 4, 5. Anything to the right is going to be longer than the 3. It's telling me include the 3. How many were 3 inches or longer? Okay, so in the 3 column, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I'm not done because now I've got to do the longer part, right? 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. There were 13 worms that were 3 inches or longer. Make sense? I hope so. All right? Let's take a look at number 5. Now I want you to try to do this. How many worms were 2 inches long or shorter? 2 inches long or shorter. Where are you going to start looking? Where did it tell you to start in the question? On the 2. Start here. Okay? So we're going to have to count those. Now where is shorter? What's shorter than 2? Which of these numbers will be shorter than 2? Do you know it? Yeah, 1 is shorter than 2. So I need to count these and those. Count those and tell me how many there are. There are 5. 2, 3, 4, 5. There are 5 worms that were 2 inches or shorter. Okay? So you got it on those questions, on those 4 or more, 3 or less. Okay? Find the number. And can you circle around it? Sure, you can mark that number. Sure, you can. Mark it, and then look to the right, look to the left. Greater is always going to be to your right. Less is going to be to your left, always. All right? Were there more worms that were less than 3 inches long or more than 3 inches long? Okay, what are they asking? What am I asking you now? Were there more worms that were less than 3 inches long? Look at it. Less than 3 inches long. What's less than 3? What's less than 3? 2's less than 3. 1's less than 3. Do I count 3? No, because 3's not less than 3. 3 is 3. Less than 3. That's this and this. Well, how many were less than 3? That's 2, 3, 4, 5. So I know that number right there is 5. That's less than 3. Now, it's asking, were there more worms that were less than 3 inches long or more than 3 inches long? Well, now I've got to do the other part. More than 3. What's more than 3? Right? Because that's what it's asking. More than 3. What's more than 3? 4 and 5, right? 4 and 5 are more than 3. So how many were in the 4 and 5? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So here I had, in these two I had 6. In these two I had 5. Let's answer the question. Were there more worms less than 3 inches long or more than 3 inches long? More than 3 inches long. The last question I have, how many worms were more than 2 inches long but less than 5 inches long? Okay, now you've got 2 rules you have to follow here. Did you see what they were? Did you see what they were in the question? They have to be more than 2. Well, what's more than 2? What's more than 2? 3, 4, 5. More than 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay? More than 2 is 3, 4, 5. it also has to be less than 5. What's less than 5? 1, 2, 3, 4. Those are less than 5. Okay? 1, 2, 3, 4. So, my question is, which ones fit? Let me do that with a different color. Okay? I did those in green. Okay? 3, 4, 5. Those are more than 2. Now I'm going to do less than 5. Less, 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 less. Which numbers have 2 marks under them? Which ones were both more than 2 but less than 5? Which ones? 3 and 4. Is 3 more than 2? Yes. Is it less than 5? Yes. Is 4 more than 2? Yes. Is it less than 5? Yes. So I've got to count all the worms in the 3 column and the 4 column. Okay? And you might be saying, well, 2 is less than 5? It is. But is 2 more than 2? Nope. It's got to match both. So these matched both. Okay, so I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. There were 10 worms that were more than 2 inches long, but less than 5. When you're reading your questions, okay, I don't think the line plot is what gets it. You have to look at the question, and you've got to slow down, and you've got to start marking like Mr. Carey did. Where are they telling me to look? Because once you know where to look, it's pretty easy, isn't it? Because all you got to do is count them, okay? So there's a link on in the description box. Click on the link, and there's a worksheet for you to practice on. And when you're done, you can look at the answers, okay? All right, give it a shot. Work hard.